Hello everyone! Today we are going to be painting in the forest, and I'll talk about my methods and lessons learned. Then we'll come back into the studio and I'll talk about how I use those lessons to improve and what I'm thinking about as I paint. This is my view, and I am going to paint some of the things that we see off in the distance, which in this camera makes it look really far away, but it's actually not. There's some trees over here that I think are really great with the light coming through. So that is what I'm going to focus on. I finally found my little travel palette, my travel case for gouache. It keeps it wet and it's super convenient. So we're gonna check that out today for the video. Here you see me using a viewfinder. This is a little tool that helps isolate one area of the landscape so that you can focus on finding a pleasing composition. You can get these online or even just make one out of gray board. And the reason you would want to use a gray material is because it allows you to see the colors and values of your scene a little bit easier when you look through it. After a quick sketch, it's time to paint. I found this sealable palette, which I thought was lost during my move, and I love it because it's great for keeping gouache from drying out so quickly, and you can just seal it up and throw it in your bag and not worry about anything spilling. When I first arrive to a place that I want to paint, I really try to identify what it is that called to me, what it is that speaks to me about the location. And in this case, it was the really bright light that was pouring through the trees and the intense vibrancy of all the different greens. Since cameras have a difficult time capturing accurate colors within the lights and shadows, painting on location is perfect for taking color notes. So even more than that, it helps us capture the initial gut reaction that like what attracted us to the place. And without that, you can easily look at a reference photo later and just feel uninspired because they lack that ambiance and that first feeling that you had on location. Some people would call these colors garish, and that might be true, but to me, it's more important to capture the essence of the location, of the spot that I'm in, and what I see in person is actually super intense. I don't shy away from any colors or techniques when I'm in the field, just because like some people would say you can't do that or you have to paint a certain way. I would do whatever it takes to capture that feeling, because for me that is the most important thing that I can take back to the studio with me. So as I work through my layers on this painting, I'm actually exaggerating the colors a little so that later I can remember how very intense the light felt coming through the foliage and pouring into the forest. I also make sure to add in the variety of colors I see in the shadows, especially because cameras just are terrible at capturing that. And when I look back on this, plus my references in the studio, I can use all that information to make better decisions when color mixing. Back in the studio, I'm able to distill my experience, and using a combination of the video reference I took and my plein air study, I can make a plan of action. So lesson learned number 1. On location, I didn't spend enough time observing the distant elements. I simply put blobs of paint that somewhat captured the light, the bright light that was coming through the forest, but really no forms in the background. So in my studio version, I took my time slowly building up the depth behind the clearing. I used thinner washes, almost like watercolor, to make sure some of that bright blue sky and the backlit, almost neon green foliage would later peek through. I used somewhat abstract forms here, knowing that it would just be kind of like a supporting area to my focal point later. And I also kept these background elements a little bit more muted so that my foreground and focus area could stand out even more. My second lesson learned is that I felt that my study didn't actually have a strong focus. So this time I decided to paint a bright clearing with a few isolated trees as my focal point. And I wanted it to still feel really lush because on location there was so much beautiful foliage and just growth everywhere, especially on the forest floor. So I wanted to capture that feeling, and I spent a lot more time on this background area, kind of building up that lushness. So I used a pretty bright greenish yellow as the base for this background area, and soon you'll see for the clearing in front of it. And then I could come back in with some of my cooler greens for the shadowy areas to really make that green pop even more. So here I'm using pretty thin washes of gouache. Again, it's kind of more like watercolor, and I'm just slowly trying to build up the depth. And it's like a fine balance between trying not to get too much detail in this background area, yet still making it feel very lush. And that's actually why I switched to my bigger brush, because I wanted to not fuss around with so many tiny details at this stage. I wanted to fill in bigger chunks of color so that I could later come back in and kind of make more detailed areas pop in the foreground. Gouache definitely experiences a drying shift, so this darker color will appear much lighter as it dries, but I need to lay in some darkness back here so that my clearing in the foreground, or actually it'll be in the middle area of the painting, will stand out against it. So I'm laying in some shadowy type colors. It's kind of a muted shadowy green, and using pretty, abstract forms and brush strokes to, indicate the trees and everything growing back there. And then on top of this, I'll add in some bright green to kind of make it pop and make it look like the light is coming through. So it's a slow buildup of all the little textures and details, while still trying to make sure I don't go too detailed back there. And I think that is something that's really hard to do on location because there's so much information in front of you. And for me, I tend to be obsessed with one thing, and I kind of will either overdo it, or maybe I just miss something else completely that was really important because I was too focused on one thing. So that's why I really like doing this, where I take my study that I did on location and take it back to the studio and try to redo it 2 or 3 times, really trying to focus on what was not so successful in my study and what I can improve upon. My final touch in this background area will be to make some pops of color so that it looks like the light is hitting just like the edge of that big bushy area, and then the clearing will be in front of it. So this bright green will really stand out against that darker green I put down. So I put this brighter green color to represent the clearing because I really want it to feel like the light is pouring into that area. So this bright green will be my highlight. And then I come back in with a much darker, cooler green in the foreground, and that will hopefully make it feel as though we're kind of peeking into this bright clearing, and it will help keep the focus more towards the center where the trees will be. You might notice I'm using this fan brush quite a lot in this painting, and it was kind of a random side challenge. I wanted to use it because I felt like it made really unique brush strokes, really interesting shapes, and I thought it was actually really perfect for creating all these lush grasses and clusters of foliage and stuff in this forest. So, third lesson learned, I wanted to capture the feeling of light wrapping around the trees, which I attempted in my study, but I didn't quite nail it. So in the studio version, I used warmer browns, especially in the upper areas of the trunks and the branches, and I didn't go too dark in any one spot on the tree. I kind of stuck with more of a purplish brown for the shadowy areas, which I knew would dry a little bit lighter and still be kind of muted. Because also green is the complement to red, so if I use more of a reddish or purpley color, it will make these trees stand out even more. If you've watched any of my past gouache videos, you have seen me do this technique plenty of times where I start off the painting with much thinner washes, like watercolor style, and then I slowly start building up the thickness of my layers as I go. So here I'm starting to get thick now. I'm starting to lay down pretty heavy gouache on these trees so that none of the background shows through because I don't want, grass to be visible through my tree trunks. But it's just like a slow buildup. I don't really do any really thick stuff until way later in the painting. And the really wonderful thing about gouache is that you can just constantly blend into what's already down on the paper. And I love that freedom and the ability, like if I swipe this purple up into the orange, it just naturally gives me that perfect gradient because it's blending into it. All right, fourth lesson learned was that I really didn't spend any time on the branches or the foliage and the leaves of the trees in my study. And like I know I was trying to do it pretty quick, like a 10-minute sketch, but I think it would have been helpful if I spent more time on them in the study because I didn't really have a lot of good color notes for them. So that's like a thing I have to remember in the future is don't ignore what's above the tree. And I used my video reference a lot for that part up on top, and you'll see that it still is pretty, it's not the focus or anything, and it stays kind of abstract, but it would have been helpful if I had done better color notes for that upper area. One thing I find really difficult in forests is making the foliage stand out, yet not be too distracting. So in this case, I stayed pretty simple and I used a dark tone for my background leaves because they're kind of silhouetted against the bright sky. And in the lower area where the light would be pouring through them a little bit, I added a little bit more of a brighter green. And they're still not as bright as the grass because I didn't want to like have a ton of bright speckles there. So it was just kind of like a test to see if that would work. And I guess we'll have to see towards the end of the painting. I also did some more shadowy tones of green, like bluer green in the foreground grasses. And it's like a bush covered in purple flowers and also some brambles. So it's kind of a big mess of green, but I liked the fact that it wasn't too detailed. It just gives like a hint of what it actually is, and your eye, maybe looks at it for a little bit and then it goes into the forest clearing and looks at the big trees. So that was really what I was trying to capture in the foreground. My final lesson learned, and this applies to the studio version as well, is not to do so many repetitive types of brush strokes. So instead of using the same brush that uses really scratchy marks for the entire painting, I wish I had done something a little bit different for some areas, like something maybe a little bit more flat or chunkier. But that's just something I can use in future paintings. I hope you guys enjoyed this session of lessons learned. I have a few more of these planned. Let me know if you have any questions or if you want me to address anything specific in the future. I really enjoy talking about this process because it's how I teach myself how to paint. Also, I'm very much open to suggestions, and if you guys see something that I missed and think that I could learn from it, so don't hesitate to leave a comment. All right, I will see you guys again in the next video. I hope you're all staying well and staying inspired.